In the early 1940s, when the shadow of war hung over every continent and the roar of fighter plane engines echoed across the skies, the world seemed to be hurtling along on a runaway train. In Europe, the Nazi German army gradually became a terrifying storm, sweeping away all obstacles in its path and seizing half the continent in just a few months. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the Japanese Empire expanded its influence with powerful carrier fleets, spreading fear from Pearl Harbor to distant mountain ranges in Southeast Asia. Yet amid this brutal maelstrom, 5 great battles flashed like lightning and altered the course of history. Each of these battles carried its own story, where human resolve, the determination of commanding generals, and unforeseen moments of surprise converged to create unexpected turning points. People often say that Germany's blitzkrieg induced a profound terror. Indeed, by 1940, Paris had fallen, and all of Western Europe held its breath at the sight of the swastika flag flying across the continent. At that moment, on the far western horizon, the small island nation of Britain stood as the last bastion. Many historians later commented that if Britain had collapsed, the door to Europe's liberation might have remained shut for an unknown length of time. Thus, when Hitler ordered the preparation of Operation Sea Lion, a plan to invade Britain by sea, the entire world waited anxiously. However, before setting foot on British beaches, Hitler knew he first had to annihilate the Royal Air Force, RAF. The Germans firmly believed in the formidable power of the Luftwaffe, whose might had already been proven in the skies over Europe. Indeed, during the first weeks of summer 1940, air raid sirens wailed from London to Dover, while waves of Messerschmitts and Stukas relentlessly bombed British airfields and radar stations. Yet, in the midst of this bombardment, RAF pilots, exhausted though they were, continued to take off day and night, partly aided by radar technology and partly by their unyielding resolve. Just as Winston Churchill famously proclaimed, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The Luftwaffe's initial onslaught failed. It was said that British airfields destroyed during the day were swiftly repaired overnight. And when Germany switched to bombing London in hopes of crushing civilian morale, that very morale only further strengthened the will to fight. Britain held onto its skies, and Operation Sea Lion could never be launched. The Battle of Britain, once believed to be the blow that would extinguish the Allies' last spark of hope, ultimately became a powerful testament that Nazi Germany could, in fact, be stopped. Even as Britain stood firm, Germany looked to prove its strength by suddenly turning eastward. In late June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. Millions of German troops lined the Soviet border, with tanks and artillery weaving through the plains of Ukraine and shattering numerous Soviet armies within weeks. In Moscow, Stalin was initially stunned by the enemy's swift advance. The Soviets lost many major cities, and at one point, the invaders were alarmingly close to the capital. However, in this dire situation, the Soviets constructed a staunch defensive perimeter around Moscow, making use of the Winter General as a silent ally. German troops, ill-prepared for the harsh cold, lacked proper winter gear. Fuel froze, artillery seized up, and tanks were immobilized in the mud and then the snow. The order, "not one step back," later reflected in Soviet directives, became the Red Army's guiding principle. Once several elite divisions from Siberia were redeployed to the capital, the tide began to turn. On a frigid night in late 1941, the Red Army launched a sudden counteroffensive, driving German forces away from the outskirts of Moscow. It's been recounted that a Soviet officer, standing atop a tank in the suburbs, his breath visibly freezing in the air, exclaimed with shining eyes, "Now is the time for our retaliation." The defeat at Moscow crushed Germany's dream of a quick blitzkrieg in the Soviet Union and marked the first time the Nazi war machine could be repelled on land, rather than merely held at bay in the air above Britain. Yet, Hitler would not concede so easily. 1 year later, having failed in the north, Germany shifted its focus southward into the Soviet Union, aiming to capture the oil-rich Caucasus and cut off transport routes along the Volga River. Stalingrad, named after Stalin himself, became the strategic and symbolic target. Situated on the banks of the Volga, it was a crucial industrial hub and transportation link. Losing it would mean severing a lifeline for the Soviets. Field Marshal Paulus led Germany's Sixth Army, in an offensive towards Stalingrad in late summer 1942, while the Soviet side fought with desperate resolve, turning every building, factory, and bunker into a fortified stronghold. Soldiers recounted that on Mamayev Kurgan, when darkness fell, the snow was stained red with blood. Artillery never ceased firing, and calls for reinforcements echoed hoarsely. The Red Army adopted the phrase, "fight for every brick," as its rallying cry. Indeed, they fought for every meter of ground. In November, the tide turned when the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, encircling the Romanian and Hungarian units defending the German flanks, and trapping the German forces in the heart of Stalingrad. The harsh winter tightened the noose, and the Luftwaffe's airlift efforts were wholly inadequate for the massive logistical needs of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Finally, Paulus surrendered in February 1943, a staggering blow. A German officer wrote in his memoirs, "We did not just lose a battle, we lost our belief in invincibility." Indeed, Stalingrad shattered Hitler's dreams of domination and paved the way for the Red Army's expansive counteroffensive. While battles raged unrelentingly in Europe, the Japanese Empire grew increasingly emboldened after its successful surprise attack at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Believing another swift naval strike would force the United States out of the Central Pacific, Japan set its sights on Midway, a small atoll, yet a vital stepping stone to Hawaii. If Midway fell, the route to Hawaii would be open, and America would be cornered. However, American intelligence turned the tables by cracking Japan's codes. Forewarned of the impending strike, Admiral Nimitz laid a naval trap around Midway. In early June 1942, 4 of Japan's renowned carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were struck by American dive bombers during the critical moments when they were switching ordnance on their decks. This rendered the ships ablaze and soon sinking beneath the waves. On the U.S. fleet, many sailors wept with joy, while the Japanese, known for their elite tactics, were stunned to face the stark reality that over half their carrier force had been wiped out. A Japanese officer later reflected, "We realized then that Lady Luck had abandoned us at Midway." From that point on, the United States ramped up warship production and steadily regained ground, retaking key islands in the Pacific and tightening the encirclement around Japan. By 1944, as the Germans' weaknesses became increasingly clear under Soviet pressure, top Allied commanders from Britain and the United States decided to break through on a new front. They knew that to end the war in Europe swiftly, a second front had to be opened by attacking German-occupied France directly. On the eve of June 6, 1944, tens of thousands of Allied troops in Britain anxiously awaited the call to mobilize. General Eisenhower penned a letter to the troops, stating, "The eyes of the world are upon you. We will accept nothing less than full victory." At dawn, landing craft, warships, bombers, and airborne divisions poured onto the beaches of Normandy and northwestern France. Although Germany had built its formidable Atlantic Wall with artillery and bunkers, Allied forces possessed overwhelming power. Omaha Beach saw the heaviest American casualties, with machine gun fire ripping through the air like driving rain. Yet the troops finally established a foothold. Unit by unit, regiments advanced inland, securing bridges and crossroads, and forging links with the French resistance. When darkness fell on D-Day, the Germans realized in horror that they had failed to halt the largest amphibious invasion in history. By late summer 1944, Paris was liberated. Coordinated with the Red Army's fierce offensive from the east, the Germans now faced war on 2 fronts, leaving the fascist regime no escape. Churchill, with a mix of relief and resolve, declared, "Once we have our foot on the mainland, we shall never let it go." From the skies over Britain to the freezing outskirts of Moscow, from the ruined factories of Stalingrad to the strategic atoll of Midway in the Pacific, and finally the beaches of Normandy, these 5 battles established irreversibly pivotal turning points in World War II. The Battle of Britain thwarted German plans to invade the British Isles, thereby proving Nazi Germany was not invincible. The Battle of Moscow demonstrated that the Soviet Union's defensive fortitude and organizational capacity could halt the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg, forcing the Germans to slow down for the first time in the face of a harsh winter. Following that, the Battle of Stalingrad destroyed one of Germany's key armies, enabling the Red Army to transition into a full counteroffensive. In the Pacific theater, the Battle of Midway significantly halted Japan's naval expansion and allowed the United States and its allies to regain maritime dominance. Lastly, the Normandy landings, an invasion of unprecedented scale, shattered Germany's anticipated defensive barrier in Western Europe and opened the route into France, hastening the end of the war. In hindsight, it becomes clear that these victories stemmed not only from material strength, but also from decisive command, effective use of intelligence, and the unwavering determination of Allied forces and civilians. The trajectories of these 5 pivotal battles illustrate that no power can maintain superiority when faced with coordinated strategy, steadfast resolve, and substantial industrial support on the opposing side. Ultimately, this courage, inventive tactics, and vast joint operations dramatically reshaped the outcome of World War II, leaving enduring lessons for the annals of military history.